How's it going, guys? Shizukatsu here, and welcome to part 1 of my Tikilen guide. In this part, we'll be going over what characters and items I think are the most important for you to be prepping for the fight, as well as a little bit of team building theory as well. Before we begin, let's go over a few disclaimers. First off, this is an extremely difficult fight, and a decent chunk of the player base will not be able to beat her on release. But don't let that discourage you. This is permanent content, and you will be able to come back later once you have a better roster or better equipment and try again. While I will be making a lot of 4-star recommendations throughout this video, if you want to beat Tikilen as early as possible, you will have to use guide stones liberally to go to Awakening 3 in order to use those 4 stars reliably without them dying all over the place. Second, this video will obviously contain spoilers for the fight, as we will be going over some of the details of the fight in order to justify why we're bringing certain characters. I won't be going over everything though, gotta save some of that for the second part of the guide coming up soon. If you're the kind of player that wants to tackle new content blind before looking at any sort of assistance, I advise you turn off the video now and come back later if you need the help. Third, the community as a whole has a sneaking suspicion that Hanet may be released alongside the Tikilen fight in next week's patch. While she isn't confirmed to be an upcoming unit, she would be a massive potential asset for the fight if she does end up getting released, so I will be mentioning her here and there throughout the video where applicable. With the disclaimers out of the way, let's briefly talk about the tournament structure. Arena tournaments consist of 8 fights, starting out easy and escalating in difficulty the further up you get. You can change parties in between each of the 8 fights so you can adjust as needed. However, you cannot bring allies into the fight, and also grade bonuses on all weapons and armor are ignored. If you lose a fight, there are no penalties, so you do not have to restart all 8 fights over again, and you can continue from where you left off. Feel free to keep playing fights over and over to test different setups and find the right setup to do the job. As far as the reward structure goes, assuming it's the same as JP, the 7 fights leading up to the final Tikilen fight will give a total of 280 rubies, as well as an accessory for 15% win damage up. The last of the 8 fights is against the arena champion, in this case, Tikilen. If you can defeat her, you can unlock her as a 5-star character. As arena champions cannot be pulled from gacha, you cannot get awakening stones for them. However, the awakening stones will eventually be added into the game much later as part of the rewards for the job towers. After defeating a champion for the first time, you can refight them anytime you want in the Book of Recollection. Defeating them in a refight gives you fragments that can be used to trade in for a couple specific things in the exchange. 13 refights worth of fragments gets you the Arena Champion's exclusive accessory, which can only be equipped to them. Apart from that, fragments can be used to buy extra personal guide stones for the champion at a rate of 24 guide stones per refight victory. For equipment in the fight, I recommend using combinations of defensive equipment on your characters that either result in fairly balanced defenses or a bit more towards magic defense. Note that this does not mean you should just default to balanced defensive equipment. Take your character's base defensive stats into account and equip accordingly. For accessories, your lower HP characters will appreciate as much max HP as they can get. Max HP is valued much more than just defensive stats alone. In English, you have access to an accessory that gives 200 HP, as well as a couple that give 100. Another accessory you can equip is the Bronze Crest of Wind, which is a random reward from hunts. These give 5% wind resistance up as well as 20 or 40 HP, depending on whether it's a Crest 1 or Crest 2. On your 5-star damage carries, I recommend equipping Dragon Scarves to make sure they don't run out of SP. Since they're going to be your most frequent attackers, it's likely that you're going to be using them a lot throughout the fight, and you want to keep their SP counts healthy. For the character paired with your regen healer, you always want them equipped with as much HP regen through Beastly Scarves as possible, since they will never be the recipient of the regen buff. Alright, now let's get on to what you guys are all here for. Who are the most valuable units that you should be preparing for the fight? Let's start with who I think are the absolute MVPs, Teo and Ashlyn. Starting with Teo, survivability is extremely important in arenas. These opponents hit extremely hard, and without constant health restoration, your party members will be falling quickly and often. Teo is currently the only 5-star in the game with AoE regen, which also applies wind resistance up to all affected allies. Regen offered by 4-star characters such as Cedric and Menno are significantly weaker and also cannot be extended to 5 turns by boosting, which can be a big liability in the fight. At this early into the game's release, I would probably put Teo as a mandatory inclusion for your party. Before we move on to our other MVP unit, let's take a quick look at the enemy weaknesses. All 3 opponents are weak to both bows and light magic, with both adds also being weak to spear and lightning. Now you might be asking, why don't I consider Scarecrow an MVP unit instead of Ashlyn? Many arena champions have unique gimmicks that you won't see anywhere else. In Tikilen's case, late into the fight she enters a phase where she can only be hit by crits. Anything that isn't a crit will not land at all. No damage dealt and no shield points removed. Ashlyn is notable for being the only hunter currently in the game with access to a guaranteed crit ability, making him an essential unit if you don't want to absolutely lose your mind once Tikilen enters this phase. If Honnet were in the game, she would take Ashlyn's spot as an MVP. Honnet has access to a guaranteed crit ability of her own, allowing her to fill this niche, but also has access to Arrow Storm, a bow AoE that hits 3 to 5 times at random. With all enemies in the fight being weak to bows, Honnet is a fantastic unit at all stages of the fight. In any arena fight, having an attack debuffer is extremely important as the enemies can do pretty stupid amounts of damage. Being the queen of debuffers, Viola is the most obvious choice for the role, with access to anti-attack, as well as anti-guard for speeding up the fight with increased damage output, and double wide burst for AoE shield cracking. Lacking her, Kurtz is the optimal substitute, with access to anti-attack and a one-hit shield crack. Next, let's move on to attacker roles. As all of the enemies in this fight are weak to bows, they are going to be making up the core of our attacking force. First up is Scarecrow, the best available shield breaker for the fight, thanks to his 4-hit AoE bow, and your best available source of damage as well. As a 4.5 star, he could still contribute offensively with his 2-hit AoE bow, but probably lacks the HP and defensive stats to reliably stay alive. While Ashlyn is valued very highly due to his guaranteed crit, he's not actually the best 4-star hunter for the fight in my opinion. That spot actually goes to Camilla, whose 2-hit AoE bow makes her a fantastic unit for breaking all enemies' shields. Additionally, her backline passive offers some additional survivability to the unit in front of her if she ever needs to move to the backline. Lucetta is my next best pick after Camilla. While she doesn't have a 2-hit AoE, she does have access to a 1-hit AoE bow that also inflicts defense down for 2 turns, which can be very useful going into break turns to increase the entire team's overall damage. If you have Viola, I highly recommend putting Lucetta and Viola in the same row, as Viola's passive will increase Lucetta's debuff duration to 3 turns per cast instead of the usual 2. While Bertrand is technically my least recommended 4-star hunter, he's by no means useless. His 1-hit lightning AoE can be used to hit both adds weakness, and if you have other lightning units such as Therese, bringing along Bertrand can potentially help her knock them down faster. His 3-hit random target bow can be a bit of a liability against 3 enemies, so I would recommend not using that until Tikilen is alone. Speaking of Therese, she is the optimal lightning attacker as of the release of this video. Her 3-hit lightning AoE can make quick work of the adds shield points, and she can deal a lot of damage to both of them once they're broken. That being said, I definitely don't think she's necessary, and a working composition can definitely be made without her. Since I'm pretty sure a good chunk of you guys skipped Therese's banner, I recommend using Mabel instead. She has AoE lightning in addition to a full front row wind defense up buff, which actually stacks with Teos for even more damage mitigation. She's also a fan unit, which means she can do a 3 BP normal attack against Tikilen for fast breaking later on into the fight. If you also don't have Mabel, the next best unit after would be Laura, who is also a lightning attacker, but lacks the team-wide defensive buff and the ability to attack with fans. Next up are a couple healers. Having a second healer can be very helpful alongside Teo this early into the game's lifespan, as stronger weapons aren't available yet, and the enemy's combined damage output can exceed the amount of healing Teo's regen can give in a single turn. The best available for the job is Hasumi, but Millard can do just as well. Both characters have burst healing, allowing them to heal allies in the middle of the turn, while Teo's regen can heal allies at the end of the turn. This helps keep your team out of lethal range at all times. Both characters also have access to team-wide magic defense up, which is especially helpful since a majority of the enemy's damage output is magic-based. Hasumi's buff also happens to increase physical defense, which helps mitigate Tikilen's physical damage, which does hit surprisingly hard despite her reputation as a magic attacker. Both Hasumi and Millard also have access to light magic, which can help chip down enemies' shield points once you've stabilized. With Millard, the choice is easy. You take the AoE light spell. However, for Hasumi, it's not as clear. Assuming you take Hasumi's heal and defensive buff for your first 2 slots, you only have 1 ability slot remaining. The 1-hit AoE is useful when the ads are still alive, while the 3-hit single target is better once they're gone. Personally, I prefer going with the AoE for better performance in the earlier stages of the fight, and later on, if I need to multi-hit against Tikilen, Hasumi can boost her normal attack since Tikilen is weak to fans. Alternatively, if you want a little bit of extra safety, you can forgo a light attack entirely and instead take Hasumi's 1-hit fan nuke that inflicts magic down to lessen Tikilen's offensive impact. If you happen to have both Millard and Hasumi, you can take a much more offensive kit on Hasumi instead, allowing her to act as a light damage dealer. An example setup would be 3-hit light, 1-hit light AoE, and the 1-hit fan debuff nuke. If you're lacking either unit, the next best unit to bring is Mina. While she doesn't have any magic defense buff like either of them, she does have a little bit of AoE healing, as well as light magic and the ability to use fans to chip down Tikilen's shields. While offensive buffers such as Lynette and Primrose can be very useful, they do have a bit of a tendency to be win more units in this particular fight. In the Tikilen encounter, survivability and stabilization are much more important than dealing a ton of damage and ending the fight as soon as possible. In other arenas such as Glossum and Varkin, there will be more emphasis on dealing more damage in a shorter amount of time, but in Tikilen, you're not really on any sort of clock as long as you're not dying. That being said, both Lynette and Primrose can still be very good units to bring along. In addition to their standard offensive buff utility, they're both also fan users, which as mentioned previously can be very strong for quickly knocking down Tikilen's shields. One unit that I think a lot of people will be trying out is Gilderoy. In addition to having an AoE spear attack in Bolt Spike to help contribute to bringing down the ads, he has access to his iconic AoE taunt skill. Being able to attract all of the enemy's attention to himself while raising his own defenses can make him a pretty strong defensive asset, but you will need to watch out in the later stages of the fight, where Tikilen's strongest attack does have the capacity to 100 to 0 him if you're not being diligent about your buffs and debuffs. That pretty much sums up all of my character recommendations for Tikilen, so next, let's take a look at a couple sample compositions. First, we have the team that I actually used to beat Tikilen myself in JP. While this does have a few units that aren't available in English, we can identify their role and swap them out for an appropriate unit that is currently available. Keep in mind, I didn't beat Tikilen for the first time until 4 months after she came out, simply due to just not pulling very much, if at all, for the first several months of playing. That being said, even if I did have these units or their equivalents at the time of Tikilen's release, I'm fairly confident that I still would not have been able to win for the first few months, and I would mostly attribute that to JP not having Awakening until first anniversary, making my 4-star units significantly weaker. Anyways, let's take a look at the composition. In place of Teo, I used Agnes from the Bravely Default collab as my regen caster, with Millard as the burst healer. For attackers, I of course brought Ashlyn in order to hit Tikilen during her crit phase, and Camilla and Lolo as other hunter attackers. Lolo is basically interchangeable with Lucetta, but I would also want to swap Ashlyn and Viola in that case in order to make use of Viola's passive to extend Lucetta's debuff. Gilderoy was used as a tank, and the unit behind him is an Ice Scholar 4-star named Kenneth. I didn't use Kenneth for anything other than his passive, which is 5% free SP regen per turn to the unit in front of him. Basically, the idea was that Gilderoy is going to stay in the front line the entire fight, and since he isn't going to the back line to gain any SP regen naturally, Kenneth allows him to gain SP regen through his passive. I think Gilderoy is probably a much better unit when running a lot of weaker 4-star characters, especially if they don't have the extra defensive stats and HP from Awakening, since they're much more susceptible to getting killed. That being said, Gilderoy definitely had some close calls in my run, and I specifically remember him getting dropped from full HP to around 200 from Tikilen's strongest attack, and this was with his own defensive buff plus Millard's, and Viola's anti-attack debuff as well. With Teo, it probably would have given a lot more breathing room with the wind defense up, but I didn't have Teo at the time, and Agnes did the job well enough. Next, let's take a look at what I would consider to be a fairly optimized and well thought out EN Tikilen team. Of course, we have Teo plus a second healer. This can be either Hasumi or Millard, but I used Millard in this example. Additionally, we have Ashlyn, who I've placed behind Millard. The idea behind placing Ashlyn here specifically is because you never need both Millard's healing and Ashlyn's guaranteed crit at the same time. Healing is much more important for the first half of the fight when there are 3 enemies. Once the ads are cleared, healing is a bit less important since only Tikilen's damage is remaining, and Ashlyn ends up being needed for the crit phase. For attackers, I have Scarecrow for his 4-hit AoE bow, Therese for her 3-hit AoE lightning, and Camilla for her 2-hit AoE bow. If Haunted comes out, I would replace Camilla with her, and since you wouldn't need to bring Ashlyn anymore, I would replace him with Mabel. My final slot in this example comp is Lynette, but this is honestly a wildcard slot as I don't consider Lynette to be absolutely necessary. And that covers everything for this first part of my Tikilen guide. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. In the second part of my guide, I'll be going more in depth on the mechanics of the fight itself, and I'll probably also upload a video or two showcasing the fight itself with some sample compositions from my JP account, so look out for those. Until then, this has been Shizukats. See ya!